joining us. So good evening, everyone, from Crete, from the Hellenic Mediterranean University, and from the International Relations Office of our university. Together with in collaboration with the Athena European University, we are running this colloquia talks in soft skills development and also research skills development, mainly from the student's point of view. So the research skills development includes how to write a proposal, how to write a paper, how to review a paper, and this kind of general tips that they will come later on as the colloquia talks are involving until the end of June. As a part of the program, initially we have announced my lecture in presentation skills, but since today and for the next 2 weeks, we have a delegation from the Rutgers University here in Hellenic Mediterranean University as a part of our collaboration with US institutions. I had a fruitful discussion with the executive director of Rutgers Global, Professor Dan Waite. So we discovered with Dan that he's doing a lot of things regarding soft skills development along his research. So I told him, why not? I mean, join our course today. And as a very typical, I will say, US citizen, he reacted very fast and he accepted immediately our challenge. So excuse me for this change, but I think I'm confident that this is for a program with a higher impact to all of us. My lecture will follow next week, depending on the program. I should check. And let me welcome with us the Professor Dan Waite from Rutgers. Few words about Dan. The title of his talk is entitled Engaged Learning Pedagogies for the Development of Soft Skills. This is very much related with the discussion that we had in the last meeting of our department, the Department of Electronic Engineering. What does it mean engaged learning and student-centered learning and teaching? So I think that Dan's talk today will have an impact on the discussion and the fruitful discussions that we had within our department last week. A few words about Dan. Dan has a PhD in international higher education from the UCLA, also has received education in higher educational topics from the Harvard University in the US. So I would like to welcome him and thanks him for accepting our challenge. And the floor is yours, Dan, for the next 45 minutes. So thank you very much for the acceptance and the honor to speak with our audience about this exciting topic and how pedagogies and way of teaching can develop soft skills that they are so important for the market. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much for the welcome. And actually, I'm the one who's honored. I'm jumping into your learning community at the last moment, but this is really a topic that I do care about deeply, and so I'm excited to have a chance to join all of you. I should give a few things just in background. I am both a scholar and a practitioner, but this topic is one that I will be coming at today more as a practitioner. So I think certainly there's a lot of things I'm going to talk about that are theories that I have developed through practice. These are not necessarily things where I have done extensive research on. So that's a bit of my disclaimer. Many of these I hope are topics that researchers in the future, and perhaps myself included, can come back and do larger scale studies. Much of this is thinking that is developed from my own practice of working with both students and faculty, and I'll share in a little bit some examples of what I've done. So I'm going to today maybe be giving case studies. I also definitely want to hear your thoughts, and as I'm talking today, please, if anyone wants to raise your digital hand, I'm happy to stop and take questions, or we can also do that at the end as well if you'd prefer. So I'm happy for this to be a dialogue. I again don't necessarily know that I consider myself the expert on this, but it's something I believe in strongly, and hope that what we talk about today will have some value. I'm going to, let's see, share my screen. Give me just a moment. And I put together a very quick presentation, so forgive me, there may be some blanks and misspellings, but be patient with me on that. So give me just a moment. Let's see. All right, can everyone see this? I'm going to switch to presentation mode. Let's see. All right, here we go. I think everyone can see this great. So again, my name is Dan Waite. I'm the Executive Director of Rutgers Global Study Abroad, also the Center for Global Learning. We are the branch of Rutgers University, which is the State University of New Jersey, that focuses on global learning and student exchange. We have about 80,000 students across our 3 campuses, and these students are recognized, of course, are coming from a vast array of disciplines, both undergraduate and graduate, including the students that I'm currently here with in Greece and in Crete with on a program at this moment. So just a little bit about the approach that I take. My background, my training is in education as well as sociology, and in my specialties have been in ethnographic research. So the approach I take towards some of what we're talking about today flows out of what I would call ethnographic thinking, belief in systems theory, and the fact that when we're addressing a topic like soft skills, that there are many different factors and many different systems that we have to take into account. There are no simple answers. And then I think you perhaps, even in this series, done some work on design thinking, and that's an approach I take as well. My research interests kind of are at the intersection. Most recently, I'm doing a lot of work on the intersection between global learning and diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in higher education. At least in the US context, these tend to be kind of separate issues, global learning and issues of diversity and inclusion. I believe there's a large overlap. So that's where a lot of my current work is. But I've also certainly in the past done research on the future of the university is something I'm interested in, especially what I would call high impact engaged learning. Another way to approach this, I suppose, is to call it experiential learning. I like to call it engaged learning, and you'll see in a few minutes why I choose that term. And then I'm particularly interested in engaged learning in practice. I'm a practitioner, so I want to know not just what's the theory of learning, but how do we in our university context actually put this into practice and with all those challenges. So a lot of what I do more than research, because I am an administrator, is I put together events, whether it's faculty training, student trainings. The picture you see here is an event I did in Los Angeles a few years ago, where I brought together a mix of educators from the higher education world, but then about half of our group were people who I would consider experts in engaged learning, for the sake of this discussion today, the development of soft skills, who are not in higher education, because I think some of the most interesting things happening right now in terms of soft skill development, unfortunately, we're not going to find in the university. The university tends to be behind the curve on these, on matters of pedagogy. And I think it's fascinating sometimes that even our schools of education don't necessarily have the most interesting and engaging kinds of pedagogy. I found this pedagogy in many other corners of the and sometimes even informal learning spaces. If you're interested, I can share a link at the end. I wrote an article about a community fitness program that I was part of, and all the kinds of soft skill development and the transformative pedagogy I saw happening in this low-income urban community, where people were coming together at 5:15 in the morning, 3 days a week, to develop a community of practice, and to essentially, they wouldn't have called it this, but they were working on their soft skill development. And I thought their pedagogical approach was amazing, things that I could be using in the university. And so I think we have a lot to learn, not just from our schools of education, but even from these marginal spaces where really interesting things are happening. So again, I currently live in New Jersey. I grew up on the island of Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean. That's where I consider myself from. And happy to be with you all in all the different places you're coming from today. All right, and these are some of the questions, just as I was thinking about our conversation today, that we may or may not, depending on where this goes, think through what kind of pedagogical practices are most effective in developing soft skills. By the way, soft skills is a common term that we all know. I wish our fields would take a less soft term for what we think are what we call soft skills. I like essential skills, and I've heard other people use other kinds of terminology, but regardless of whether we call it soft or essential skills, I think this is very critical. And I'll give you an example from my institution, and why I think that this group that you have is so important. We just did a significant academic exercise within our institution, developing an academic master plan. And this really set all the priorities for our institution and our various campuses and schools. And one of the things that came out of that master plan process was the sense, and in higher education, we have sometimes a love-hate relationship with career readiness, but there was the sense of, as much as there's a commitment to all these key academic principles, career readiness and soft skills definitely showed up in this master plan. It's the first time for at least this institution I'd seen those soft skills and career readiness pieces show up within the context of an academic plan. What I didn't see, however, what I didn't get from that report was a sense of how do you actually teach in a way that is going to nurture those soft skills, those essential skills. Everyone now seems to agree that they're essential, but I don't think we've done enough work within higher education to really understand how might we have to change the way we do things to actually nurture those skills, and to also be honest about, and this is kind of the second question, what are the obstacles? Why is it that we talk about this, we believe in it, and yet in practice we don't change the way we do business within the university? So I think that's another question that I'm interested in. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, where can we find these examples of pedagogical innovation? Sometimes within the academy, I think very often it's in marginal spaces within our institutions, our universities. And then also, what might we look at outside of formal higher education? There was an interesting study from a researcher at Harvard University a few years ago called How We Gather. And the study was looking at where, I think in this case, mostly what we call millennials, younger professionals were choosing to gather their spaces, because as culture has shifted, for example, in the United States and within the European context as well, it's not necessarily spaces like church that used to be key gathering points. So where do people gather was the topic of this researcher's work, and she was looking at spaces like fitness clubs and reading groups and all these other spaces that people were, I would say, coming together to build community, but also to learn, and also developing these key soft skills of their own volition, of their own choice. And they cared enough about this that they would come back day after day, week after week to these spaces, much like that 5:15 a.m. Community fitness space I mentioned. And so I think there's a lot that we within higher education can learn from these spaces that people, even our students, choose to go to, choose to join. Sometimes I think intuitively knowing that what they're developing skill-wise in those locations is very important. So here's just a few quotes that I have found fascinating about the need for soft skills. Jack Ma, several years ago, you can see these are slides that I did about 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, because everything's going to be dated here. But Jack Ma said, teachers must stop teaching knowledge. We have to teach something unique so that a machine can never catch up with us. Jack Ma is a technologist, but here he's saying what we need to be, he's not making a case for teaching technology though. He's saying these are the soft skills that we need to be teaching: values, believing, independent thinking, teamwork, and care for others. So that's something that I think many of us believe in, but coming from Jack Ma, I found fascinating. I also have been following for a number of years. LinkedIn every year puts out something called the Workplace Learning Report. You all may be familiar with this. If you're not, I would encourage you to take a look. the 2018 report, again, I haven't been in this research for a few years, so my research is a bit dated, but in 2018, what they did is they do every year is they survey employers and they say, what are the skills you need, both hard skills, soft skills. And it was really, there was a shift that happened. And I think 2018 was the first year where they noted that what employers were coming back and talking about most as being needed. Again, they said in the age of automation, the pace of change is fueling the demand for adaptable, critical thinkers, communicators, and leaders. In other words, what we call soft skills. Here's the thing, though. This is my conviction that drives me. I think the traditional classroom and even online learning, many of us been doing a lot of online learning over the past few years due to the pandemic, does not necessarily effectively develop those high demand soft skills. Some of you may see this differently, and I'm not saying that soft skills can't be developed in the traditional classroom or in online learning. I think that those are maybe often not the most effective spaces. And I don't think it's either or, like we have to choose one or the other, but I really believe that within higher education, there's a need to think outside of the classroom. Research does suggest that we're often failing students in these missions. The book Academically Adrift, which was a study of university students from a little over 10 years ago, found that 45% of students do not demonstrate any significant learning improvements in their first 2 years in the university. That was a somewhat controversial book when it came out, but they've and others have done research that shows something similar. I also have this data from the McKinsey report of about 9 years ago that 40% of employers struggle to find college graduates with the right skills for entry-level positions. Again, this is US-based research. I'd be curious to know within the European context if that's similar. But if those are true, then we really are failing in our mission to prepare students for the 21st century workplace in the university. And I think part of this is due to what I would call a passive campus-centric education model that limits graduates' opportunities to engage in society, to have the impact on society that we want them to have. And I also think there's a piece of this too that really has to do with soft skills are human skills, is another term that I've heard used. And human skills are important because we care about human transformation. We want to see not just more capable automated workers. We want to see our students be more human. And even when they're given the technical skills that we know they need for the workplace, we want them to be the kind of people that are going to lead, create things, be creators, not just consumers, the kind of people that are going to change the world. And so this is why I believe these soft skills are so important. An example I'm going to give of a space, and I'm sorry, I kind of threw these slides together, so we may be bouncing around a bit with some ideas, but one of the things that really started me thinking about this in a new way was a program I used to run called the Around the World Semester. And in this program, students went to 10 different countries over the course of, these were undergraduate students, 10 different countries over the course of 4 months. We had 2 full-time faculty, 2 to 4 graduate assistants. They had 5 different courses that they were taking that were very integrated with real world kinds of experiences. So maybe I'll skip a slide here just to show you real quick. Here we go. So this was kind of an example of what a day might look like with this program. And I'm sorry if this may be a bit small on your screen, depending on how you have it. I pulled this from something else. But imagine the students together getting up at 6 a.m. in the morning to do a workout with some local people in the city square. Then they have a journaling assignment that they're supposed to be doing over breakfast. Then at 9 a.m., they're meeting with professors, they're framing the day's activities. At 10 a.m., they have a data expedition and challenge where it's kind of a gamified learning experience. They're out in the city. In this case, we're imagining it's Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they have to collect data. So they're out engaging with people through the morning. Maybe part of this is an assignment where they're interviewing local artists. They have a lunch that had been planned with some community leaders looking at local community development. In the afternoon, they have a service learning project in partnership with some local university students. Maybe at 4, they meet one-on-one with their professor to have a coaching session on their own personal learning goals. Then again, before dinner, they debrief in smaller groups, talk about what they learned throughout the day. In the evening, they are set free to have their dinner at a market. Maybe they meet some more people in the community and talk with them. Then some of those friends they met at the Brazilian university earlier, they go swimming, go to a club at night, who knows, they're doing something fun. And then they finally come back and they know that they've got this Brazilian novel they have to read to be prepared for the next day's class. So it's a very intensive kind of program, but the idea here is that student learning is very integrated across the day and across the 4 months. And the kind of pedagogical model here that is scaffolded and that I kind of imagined us doing was, you have both the community-based experience, but it's not just experience. Then you still have, so that the classroom is not irrelevant. You still have, whether it's the classroom or they're doing a class online or even self-directed learning, you still have this space where they're getting the theories, the information. Then there's also this production of knowledge, as in small groups, they're doing maybe project-based learning or an apprenticeship or something where they're putting that learning into practice. And then finally, that's being honed even further as they meet with their faculty or their graduate assistants who are giving them mentoring and coaching on their very individually focused learning goals. And so, again, this was just an experimental program, but what we found was students would come back from this, and you could just, by talking to these students, you could see their brains were on fire. I mean, these were students who said, I learned more in the last 3 months than I learned in my previous 3 years. This is, I'm going to go to grad school. I've already applied to grad school. I got an internship for the summer because I found something now that I'm passionate about. And it was fascinating because we had stripped down everything that we think we normally need to have a good university education. We'd taken away the buildings, we'd taken away the labs, and many, well, there was a lab in terms of the lab of real life, but we'd taken away the cafeterias and everything else that we think is so necessary, and really focused on mentoring students through this experiential engaged learning model. And I'm not saying that I have research and data, and I hope to have this in the future to say we've studied this across 10 similar programs and can really document the learning that happened. But certainly from a case study and my own experience, something transformative was happening here. The kind of theory that has started to emerge for me, and I'll show you a kind of how I visually look at this in a minute, is that I call this engaged learning because there's different kind of 4 different big areas of engagement that I see happening. One is that they're engaging with their selves. So they're journaling. The travel experience in this case, or the cross-cultural experience, is a kind of mirror for them to see themselves. They're also engaged with a community, a learning community, which the research shows is very important. And I think in terms of development of soft skills, all of these, I would say, are kind of like 4 pieces of the puzzle. So the self part, the community part, being both within a learning community, but also engaged with a community outside of the kind of monastic, sometimes confines of the university. So this local community engagement, they were, and this is of course important for soft skill development, they were engaged with the workplace, they were engaged with real world problems through service learning, research, company visits, multiple times a week. They were in, I guess I don't have a better way to say it, but they were in the real world. They were out, taking the theories they were learning and seeing whether or not those theories worked in the real world. And then, of course, the theories were there. They still had lectures and books they were reading, or all these other ideas that were being then tested in the real world context. This is my own kind of personal model of how I think about this. This is not anything I've published. It's just something I've kind of used myself, and as I've developed programs, tried to. So this is Dan Waite's model of engaged learning, and just again based on my own, not just my own experience, but a lot of, I would say, a lot of people I've talked to looked at spaces that tend to be really transformative, whether within the university or outside, in terms of developing soft skills, and saying, what is it then? What's the secret sauce? What are the ingredients that are coming together to make this happen? So what you're seeing here is that this is what I would call a praxis-based model. So it's an intersection between theory and practice. But you also see there's this significant, what I call the, again, I'm pushing back against the kind of IQ model, intelligence quotient, that tends to be more knowledge-centric. And I have these other quotients. So the self quotient. So with reflection, you're understanding your own role within whatever it is you're learning. With the inquiry quotient, you are learning, and this is kind of the theory piece, you're learning what the big questions are that need to be asked. You're learning about big ideas, big problems. All of this happens then, and this is really important, I think, for the development of soft skills in the context of a learning community. You're learning how to embrace people and ideas across boundaries of difference. And then finally, there's, of course, this, what I call the go quotient. It's your ability to get out of your comfort zone and engage with real world challenges and opportunities of practice. And so the actors in this are the students, schools and faculty, that's us, but also the local and global communities play a role within the higher education, as well as, kind of in my case, I have a study abroad office that I work with, but whatever those entities are that are curating the real world experience. So you have students, faculty, local and global communities, and then some entity that curates the real world engagement. That could be an internship site, et cetera. So, I hope you find this interesting. This is my attempt to kind of play around with what are the factors. And then part of what you could do, and I've used this, for example, in the past in analyzing learning spaces, to say, does my learning space provide, so you could say, does my university, does my department, if you're with a department, provide space for reflection? Do students have the time? Do they have the space? Do our campuses, for example, provide space where students are either in terms of time or physical locality able to reflect? Theory, I think we usually don't struggle with in the university. That's the part we do really well. But community, does our campus, does our department provide adequate space for engagement on a regular basis with a local or global community? And then are we providing opportunities within our space for practice? Another way that I've kind of chosen to look at this is, what is the trajectory of, if you're an engineering department, you could analyze this and say, what's the trajectory of my department or my university? I think more often the university, and I'm of course mostly familiar with the US context here, has what I would call like a centripetal kind of thing. So the forces, and some of you may come from institutions, I know in the European context, you don't always have students living on campus, and it's not as cloistered as some American campuses tend to be. And maybe you're city-based, and maybe students are very centrifugal in the way, but very often in the US, this movement is trying to pull people more and more into these spaces we've created, libraries, lecture halls, cafeterias, and the effort is to pull students in. We're constantly trying to pull students into our spaces. And then we say, oh my goodness, this is too campus centric. Let's throw in an internship. Let's throw in a service learning opportunity. But those things are fighting against the overall trajectory of the university, which is centripetal. I'm sorry, I'm not a scientist. I hope a physicist, I hope I'm using the right terms here. I have gotten these confused in the past. But the centrifugal idea is our work that we do within higher education is designed to, as much as possible, we start with students doing some kind of a learning experience, but as the education is active, it's designed as much as possible to spin students out into the real world. And yes, they come back in, and we mentor them, and we curate learning opportunities. But all of these things, internships, apprenticeships, service learning, just moving from the model of the traditional kind of athlete model to one where all students are physically engaged. I love to do activities with students like data expeditions and all kinds of, whatever I can do to get them immersed in the city. So again, this is another way to kind of think about the trajectory of student learning in a way to try to analyze that. Once you do that, then you can start to look very specifically at different aspects of the higher education systems we have and try to analyze whether they're conducive to experiential engaged learning and thus the development of soft skills. One of the things I'm personally interested in, I'm not an architect, but I think that many of our campus spaces, as Ivan Illich would say, are not convivial. They're not convivial to human flourishing. They're not convivial. They're not conducive to the development of these skills. So I've done some projects in the past where we've tried to play around with things like a micro campus. And some of you may work in some ways with something that fits like this model. So here's my drawing of, this was one that with a group of people we were imagining, what if we ensured that we only had no more than 400 students in the middle of a city, and then we tried to design the learning space so that it was constantly pushing students out into the community. So instead of having a cafeteria, they're eating in the community, they're working in the community garden. Instead of our own university arts facilities, they're engaging the local community in the arts, etc. So there's all these ways in which, and also the community then is weaving into this space so that the community is engaged with the learning even within that what you might call a campus building or a micro campus in this case. So I think space is one thing that we have to think about. Another thing I think we have to think about if we're going to do a better job at engaged learning and soft skill development is how we reimagine faculty learning and development. And I think one of the fundamental challenges in soft skill development is our lack of investment in the training and development of faculty. Because, and I'm just going to read my text here, the solutions to the current crisis in learning are going to have to involve new pedagogies, but most of us as administrators, faculty, students, we're not trained in pedagogy. And unfortunately, that means we're not even trained in the old models of pedagogy, let alone in thinking in new ways where we're using, design thinking and problem-based learning and all these other things that are so critical for soft skill development, how to be a curator of learning, how to be a mentor, coaching. So I think part of what we need to think about if we're going to develop soft skills in students is how we can help faculty retool their own teaching and learning. I used to run a program that we did a couple of times as a pilot where we would gather faculty and even staff sometimes, create a community of practice, and then we would put the faculty through their own active, engaged learning experience. So for example, I took a group of 14 faculty to China and we did service learning projects and we did research in communities and we did various kinds of field work and all the things that I think would maybe be best practices with students. And the faculty themselves had to go through this learning experience, project-based learning, to then be able to even have a model to think about how they would do this within their own teaching within their fields and disciplines. And then finally, they come back together as a learning community to develop new distinctive models of curriculum and teaching. So certainly, I do think if we're going to do this well, we need to think about how we reimagine faculty training and development. And then I just think, this is now spinning off into 100 different directions, but, I would say from my own practice and research, I mean, there's a lot of research in the US, I know, and some of you may be familiar with, high impact practices. We know that certain things, certain kinds of engaged learning, there are research studies that show impact on student learning, but I don't think we often understand yet why. Like, what is it that's happening within some of these spaces that we might call high impact learning communities, service learning, study abroad, student research, etc. What's happening there, like from a neuroscience standpoint, a science of learning standpoint, that is so conducive to the development of soft skills? Or even if we look at these other spaces outside the academy, I think, these are like, how many are there here? Maybe 8 or 9 things that I think would be worth studying that I haven't even had a chance to dig into. I mean, I think part of what I've seen happen with the programs I've run is learning happens when you're engaging positive emotions, when you're making learning playful and enchanting. I think that's why there's something about the science of play that we have yet to dig into in terms of the development of soft skills. And students in my program that were studying around the world were learning. Part of it was because they were having fun and they were enchanted with these new places they were in, and they were playing in a sense as they were learning. And so what does it mean to learn from the science of play, how soft skills could be developed? I think this may sound like the opposite, but I think it goes together perfectly. How do students also learn through challenges, through doing really difficult, hard things? Some of this could be gamification, but again, going back to this around the world semester, what I saw students really coming alive and the neurons on fire was when we pushed them to do really difficult things. And we found that students wanted to do difficult things. They wanted to be challenged. And these soft skills of resilience and teamwork and all of the others are really deeply nurtured through doing things that are challenging. But I'm sure that I know there's some emerging research out there. I think there needs to be more. I call this next skill displacement. And that would be, when we take people out of their cultural comfort zones and put them within new spaces. I do this a lot because I get to work with students who are studying abroad, but I think there's many different ways you can displace students from their cultural comfort zones, social comfort zones, as a means of kind of developing new neural pathways, running with the idea of neuroplasticity. And for example, when I lived in California, worked with a university there, we used to take students for a week-long program that was just in an urban area 15 minutes away from the campus. Students, most of them had driven through this area. They never actually spent much time there. We spent a week in that area that many of them were honestly kind of fearful of being there. And yet even within this 15-minute away urban setting, there was really deep transformative learning that happened. Another one is certainly the idea of learning communities and engagement in community as part of what makes learning transformative. There's emerging research on just what I'm calling here vulnerable narrative, personal discovery, but again, integrating students' own personal journeys. Soft skills are human skills. Human skills are nurtured in part when we're aware of our own humanity and our own, whether it's biases or fears or whatever it is that we bring to the learning experience. So I think somehow, again, I'm not claiming to have like the answer of a theory here, but I think somehow the development of soft skills, even in the university context, has to weave in somehow who students are on a personal level. The example I give of this is, with our around the world semester, one requirement of this academic program, intensely academic program, was that every student had to take a chance during this 4 months to tell their personal story to the whole group. And they were encouraged if they were able to do this in a vulnerable way. And nearly always, some students waited till the end of the semester, but they always chose to somehow be vulnerable and talking about whether it was their fears or dreams. And that may seem very soft, but that uncovering of their own narrative was so deeply woven into the learning that was happening. And maybe some of you know of research in this area, but I think that's an area that needs to be woven into whatever research happens on the development of soft skills. Certainly learning through building, whether we call that design thinking, problem-based learning, actually, building real things. My little quote is, how might higher education be different? And we focus more on what students were building instead of the buildings, the amount that we as institutions invest in buildings instead of students building them. Anyway, a little cheesy there, sorry. And I'm operating on not much sleep. So learning through human engagement, again, kind of ethnographic thinking, learning through movement. I used to work with English as a second language teachers, and one of those key theories is you've got to involve movement as you're learning the new language as part of the pedagogy. But I think there's something really powerful in soft skill development when even the teaching of theory is happening in a context, whether it's walking or building something or doing something. There is something important from a neuroscience standpoint happening there. And then again, just this whole idea of praxis, the theory of practice and reflection. The final thing I want to share here, and then we'll open it up for questions. or discussion, or you can critique me and give me ideas that are better than the ones I've just shared. I shared at the beginning that one of my interests is diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in the university. In my context at Rutgers University, we have a very diverse student population, socioeconomically diverse, ethnic diversity, religious diversity at every level, gender identity, etc. And I do believe that there's a really strong relationship between soft skill development, or the lack thereof, in the university, and how we care for and develop students that maybe have not traditionally been included in university life. And the example I'll give is, students, we at Rutgers University have a large amount of students from immigrant family backgrounds. And I think very often when you are from an economically disadvantaged or immigrant family, maybe a first generation in attending university, you haven't had the kind of preparatory schooling or education to maybe help you to be good at some of the hard skills. You may feel that you're behind on some of those soft skills that are required to succeed in the university. And yet, what I find, for example, with many of my students who are from immigrant families, is they actually have a very strong soft skill set. They've learned resilience. They've learned communication across boundaries of difference. They've learned how to work with people in really interesting ways by virtue of having had to overcome difficulty, move between cultures, maybe coming from a family that's, where they're bilingual in their home, et cetera. So all of those pieces. And so when we in higher education fail to kind of integrate soft skill development into what happens in the university, we're actually not taking advantage of these students and all that they're bringing to the table. So from, what I'd call like an asset-based approach, a student-centered approach to education, when we fail to integrate soft skill development into what we do, we're actually not taking advantage of the strengths that many of our students bring to their university experience. And that's unfortunate because, I believe, students have these soft skills, and we as faculty or administrators are failing them when we don't do this well. So, I like, for example, Scott Anthony's approach to innovation and what he calls dual transformation. I don't think when we're trying out new things in the university, we have to completely throw away the old ways of doing things. So what I'm not, just to be clear in conclusion, I'm not suggesting that we throw out everything we do and just send students on to go to 10 countries over 4 months, or that we just throw them out into the streets and that's our new model of education. I think we continue to do our existing programming and what we do well, while at the same time innovating new programming and have them kind of learn from each other. So this is, if you don't know about Scott Anthony's book, Dual Transformation, I think it's a great model of, if you're an administrator, for example, who's trying to figure out how to innovate while still keeping what you have existing and do well. So that being said, I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you for letting me ramble on about these ideas for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much for the nice talk and also for keeping the time. Excellent. I would like to give the floor to the audience if they have questions. I have note some questions to you, more to exchange some opinions, and I would like to highlight on what did you say, that the internationalization within our studies cultivates, a lot of almost all the soft skills that a scientist should have. But I will give more analysis later on through our discussion. Until, the audience will express their questions. There are a lot of comments regarding your talk. It was very interesting. And let's start, with the first question that I have. So it's very nice, the idea is a lot of, internationalization, new pedagogies. I totally agree that, can cultivate the soft skills. I would like also to highlight that this is like, however, the importance of the soft skills is something that everyone can develop. So even if you are the worst presenter in your life, or even you are the most shy people in the world, or if you are the most difficult character in the world, you can become an excellent team player, you can become an excellent collaborator, an excellent presenter. It's like up to you to self-aware your weaknesses and then get engaged in order to improve to you. But I have a question that always is on my mind. How can we measure the improvement of the soft skills? So, I mean, you will say me, you can observe it. So, for example, I had students that we ran the Scrum methodology and framework for a semester, and I could see students that they could not present anything. And then, you know, I somehow touched by the way that how better presenters they have become. So is there any quantitative way of evaluation of the soft skills development?
I mean, I think that's really such a fundamental and important next question, right? So we can say, oh, look at this model. You know, I just shared one with you. I think this model develops soft skills, but does it really? We need to answer that question. And I'll give you an example from kind of the world I live in. I believe that when students study abroad, or we have, you know, student exchange, that students are developing a soft skill that we tend to call intercultural competency, or, you know, something like that. Their ability to engage with people across boundaries of difference. Can you measure a student's ability to engage with people across boundaries of difference? Yes, I believe you can. I mean, sometimes the way you get at this, and we do this, is we have surveys, and sometimes those are benchmarked across institutions where we ask students questions before they go on the program and when they come back. I think, you know, certainly one of the dangers when we're not trying to assess these soft skills development is to assume that they automatically happen just because, you know, whatever activity we think we're doing encourages that. Example I'll share from, maybe I shouldn't name the university, but a university I used to work at I was responsible for doing a study of whether intercultural, you know, cross-cultural skill development was happening within study abroad programs. And everyone assumed that automatically, we thought what we were going to find is just some programs developed it more than others. You know, what we actually found was some programs, students came back from the program less culturally competent than when they left, which is almost hard to imagine. But this had to do with the fact that in this university, they were sending large group of American students to, you know, places like Italy, and they lived together in a big villa, and they learned from each other, and maybe they experienced something and they thought, oh, you know, I don't understand this, or I don't like this, and they were processing it with their other students. And instead of that soft skill being developed, they were actually developing, they were regressing. And so if we hadn't tried, if we had just made the assumption that the soft skill was being developed and we hadn't measured it, at this university, we ended up shutting down some of those programs because we realized they were miseducated. So, you know, just because we think a program or a type of pedagogy is going to develop a soft skill doesn't mean that it necessarily does. And we should absolutely find ways, you know, it's going to take both quantitative and qualitative research. I mean, you know, you have to have some comfort with qualitative research, qualitative data, because the qualitative data I think is often very important, but qualitative data can be scientific, and you can take a scientific approach with qualitative data to doing some analysis of whatever program, you know, pedagogy you're using to see if it does indeed produce the outcomes that we want to see happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that running surveys probably can spot, and you can spot some improvement, but I would also follow your suggestion about checking through the bibliography regarding qualitative kind of theories that supports the development of a particular set of soft skills. And I have another question, like more comes to the institutional level, since you are coming from one of the highest reputed institution in the States. So how in Rutgers do you develop a program in order to make your teachers better teachers? I mean, how do you go to the physics department and say to a very famous physics researcher, like, look, you know, you're an excellent researcher, but, you know, the evaluations that we receive from the students shows a very limited interaction with the students. And we know that the impact of a teacher to the students is substantial. I mean, if you're a good teacher, you can inspire your students to go on with the research, you can inspire them to have more ideas and also be more engaged with what is happening in the university. On the
Yeah.
opposite side, then you are just a good scientist, and this is kept to you. You have no impact to the whole process. So what are you doing in Rutgers in order to make your teachers better teachers?
That's a great question. It's important. I wish I could say we had it all figured out. I think there are pockets of the university where people are starting to pay attention to pedagogy. With some of my colleagues I'm with here right now, here at HMU, we've been discussing this idea of creating small programs where we take groups of faculty, maybe travel to a partner institution like the one we're at right now, and have them go through an engaged learning, experiential learning process where they reflect on that. It's kind of a pedagogical refresher course for those faculty themselves. So I've done some of that before. Is Rutgers doing this on a large scale? Unfortunately, no. But again, I think what you have to do, and this maybe comes down to a dean level, proctor, provost, presidential level. We put all kinds of requirements and expectations out for faculty all the time. Expectations for the number of hours they're going to teach, expectations for research, other kinds of expectations. We very rarely put out expectations for pedagogical development, and we rarely invest in the pedagogical development of our faculty. And that's, this is my rant, but the universities, at least in the U.S. context, as someone has said, as profit is to business, prestige is to universities, and universities are engaged in this prestige game, and whether it's research as the measure of prestige or buildings, these are our measures of prestige. We don't typically look at teaching and learning and the development, for example, of soft skills as our measures of the prestige of our institutions. And so for that reason, then this doesn't get prioritized, it doesn't get funded. So if we're going to change this, you have to have leadership at the highest levels that decide to prioritize funding and put an emphasis on faculty. I saw this, where I've seen this happen outside of Rutgers, is I've visited some high schools. Actually, the elementary levels of education are sometimes where some of the most interesting things are happening in pedagogy. I visited a set of high schools in Southern California that are doing just an amazing job. The way they teach is phenomenon. And so when I went to visit them and asked how do they do this, they said there's only one way we could do this. We created our own school of education. So all of our teachers actually get degrees through our own school of education, whether you're teaching science or literature, et cetera. You have to do a program through us, because they said the only way we could get the kind of pedagogy and project-based, because they do a lot of project-based, problem-based learning. They said the only way we could find teachers who do problem-based, project-based learning is to train them ourselves. So I've seen schools doing this on that lower level. I have yet to see a university that has done something like that says all of our all of our faculty are going to go through a certain kind of training to be able to teach problem-based learning, design thinking, whatever it might be that you want to do.
Excellent. But however, I would like to say, since you are coming from Harvard, in Harvard, they used to say, our reputation comes from our graduate students. So the graduate students, should, create a new research that should be inspired by their mentors. They should be high employable because they are not only by Harvard, but also because they have the soft skills. So I cannot see, teaching is an investment for bringing new money, I will say, not the opposite. So probably it's a short term to say, like publications, of course, in publications are important, but how our students, they are going to learn how to write a paper or how to evaluate a paper if someone does not teach them, how to do it? And how are they going to make nice presentations if you don't teach them how to make nice presentations? It's like to ask for a dog to speak, human language without taught him. This is something that honestly, I cannot understand. And I have another question. And obviously the last one is like you talk about ethnographic thinking. Can you please elaborate a little bit? What does mean ethnographic thinking?
Sure, and I think, you know, that's probably a term that's used in different ways. For me, what I mean when I say ethnographic thinking is my training as a graduate student was in doing qualitative ethnographic research, and so when I'm approaching a problem from a qualitative ethnographic lens, you know, for example, when I did my dissertation research, I did it the typical way where I came up with research questions. I looked at all of this literature and decided what I wanted to find out, and then I spent years doing this research, which I did my research in China with working with the Communist Youth League and on experiential learning within the Chinese university context. It was a lot of fun. But at the end of, you know, all of this research and fieldwork, part of what I discovered is that I'd been asking the wrong questions from the very beginning. And if I had taken more time to, I think part of ethnographic, an ethnographic thinking approach is, it's very similar to design thinking, and that you start with empathy. And maybe the ethnographic approach is you start by looking, you start by listening, and not assuming that you have all the answers. And so for me, that ethnographic, when I'm teaching students ethnographic thinking, you know, this program right now that we're working with health inequities, it's very easy to come in from American students in particular do this a lot, you know, come in and assume they have all the answers. So I try to teach students, even as I'm learning myself, to begin with a humble approach where I'm really observing, listening, asking a lot of questions before I even get to that point of trying to decide what the questions are that I need to answer. So maybe it's an approach to higher education that's about an openness, a humility. I love the word lately that I've been thinking about a lot is wonder, like coming into a problem or a challenge with a sense of just wonder, in the sense of things are sometimes more wonderful than we imagine, but also wonder as in curiosity, and letting that drive a lot of what I do. So for me, that's maybe not exactly the textbook definition, but that's what ethnographic thinking in many ways means for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in order to keep the message more related, it's a similar approach with design thinking, no? From what did I get?
Yeah, yes, and I think design thinking, systems thinking, ethnographic thinking are all related. I see.
Question? Yes, there is a question from our colleague in the Department of Electronic Engineering. There are a lot of questions. So thank you very much, the audience, for this engagement. Nikolaos Petrakis, a colleague of us from the Department of Electronic Engineering, he asks the following: do you think that these learning techniques can be addressed to the whole student community of a school or a university, or just to a part of them? In order to continue the question of Nikos, I'm not going to mention about address to the whole student community. It's like how the desire are the academics to apply this.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the question. I have a friend who did his dissertation research on kind of this topic of engaged learning, and part of what he was looking at is how students responded to this model of experiential engaged learning, and what he found, I can't remember the exact statistics, but I'm just going to make them up, but it was something like this. He found that it was maybe 65% of students they weren't so concerned about real world engagement. They weren't so concerned about soft skill development. They wanted to sit in a classroom. They wanted to be able to just pass an exam and get a degree and go out, and that wasn't, but there was this other 35% of students that he interviewed that they were bored in the classroom and they were frustrated, and they were just, they cared deeply about particularly these kind of soft skills, real world skills, and they felt like they weren't getting it in the university, and they kept pushing back and saying, why is the university structured the way it is? And I think that maybe has something to do with how different students are wired, to put it unscientifically, how different learning models, but there's something intriguing about that idea that some students particularly are maybe genetically inclined to want to develop those soft skills more, to want to learn. And if that's true, then perhaps you could also imagine that some faculty are more inclined to be able to teach in that matter, and that other faculty would struggle to teach soft skills because it's not as much how they're, again, perhaps oriented in the way that they think. So that would be my, Nikolaus, my attempt to answer that question is, maybe there's some part of I think every student should develop soft skills, but maybe some students want that more than others.
Or they are more convinced right now to do it. They have not failed. They are not ready to succeed yet. And
right.
There is another question from Lucia, I think from Spain, an Erasmus student, if I suspect correct. Do you think would be an interesting idea have an institution within colleges and universities that evaluates teachers and teaches them techniques to make students more interested in the subjects? Because in my personal opinion, in many of the subjects we take, the fact that we like them more or less also depends on how the teacher teaches the classes, because I also think that this is greatly influences the results of the students. So the question is like, do you think that, the universities, they should establish a real assessment tests and to provide a constructive feedback to the professors, not criticize them, how to improve their teaching abilities?
I absolutely, Lucy, I love this question. I love the idea. Do you want to come work with me?
Where is Lucia? Lucia, you have an opportunity to go to Rutgers. Open.
I think it's such a great example of what we need to be doing within universities. And yes, it's, of course, it's someone from a student perspective that's bringing this up, because students are the ones who suffer when the teaching is not good and not nurturing their humanity and these human skills the way it should. So yes, again, but this has to change at a very high level, where university administrators see the long-term value, even the financial value of paying attention to pedagogy, and then they invest in something like this idea of an institute that would, teach our faculty how to teach, essentially, and particularly within these engaged experiential pedagogies.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the answers, Lucia, for the questions. We have a comment from our colleague or student Fuad. It will be a great pleasure for me if I have a copy of these very useful and helpful slides and records of these works. Regarding the recording, everything will be shared with you through our YouTube channel, and I will appreciate Dan to share with us your slides before we will meet for dinner. Okay, otherwise no dinner. Okay.
Okay, that's a deal.
Excellent. So I suspect that I should stop the session here. We would like to thank once more Dan for his very fast reflection, and I hope that you are satisfied with this change of the program in order to have with us Dan from the Rutgers. Next week, I hope that I will have the pleasure also to give you some tips how to become professional, as I used to say, bullshitters regarding presentation skills. But I think that, this kind of surprise, it was very useful for all of us. I would like to thank you. Have a nice night, and see you next Monday with another session from the Athena Soft and Research Skills Development. Thank you, and be safe. Bye.